Miss Marple, and Puzzle of the Hidden Needle. Chapter 1. The sun bathed the gardens of Heatherfield Hall in a soft golden light, as if nature itself had decided to join the festivities. In the village of Little Belton, birthdays were private affairs. But for Mrs. Lavinia Hewitt's 75th, exceptions had been made. A marquee had been raised on the sloping lawn, bedecked with bunting and white linen tables heavy with cakes, trifles and little sandwiches. The villagers in their Sunday best wandered between the rose bushes and tea tables, exchanging pleasantries with an exaggerated cheerfulness that could not entirely mask the underlying tension. Miss Marple, small and neat in a pale lavender dress and a delicate lace shawl, sat quietly beneath a sycamore tree, knitting needles clicking softly. She smiled and nodded whenever someone passed, her blue eyes missing nothing. It was a charming afternoon on the surface, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize the quiet eddies of unease swirling beneath such scenes. "You know," said the vicar's wife, Mrs. Templeton, fanning herself briskly beside Miss Marple, "one might almost forget Lavinia's, reputation." She gave a little huff, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. Miss Marple merely smiled and adjusted a dropped stitch. "The past, dear Mrs. Templeton, has a curious habit of lingering." Across the lawn, Lavinia Hewitt herself presided, over the tea-table, her figure upright, her expression sharp beneath her broad-brimmed hat. Her daughters, Clara, the brisk and practical one, and Millicent, the dreamy, slightly awkward one, flitted about, serving guests and managing whispered complaints about the meringues being too soft or the lemonade too tart. There was, too, a quiet undercurrent of rivalry between the guests. Whispered glances exchanged between Mrs. Pennington and Mr. Arkwright, the postmaster's thinly veiled contempt toward Dr. Fallow's pompous pronouncements, the glint of dislike in young Emily Trent's eyes when she curtsied before Lavinia Hewitt. Miss Marple noted it all with the mild detachment of someone counting stitches. One knot here, another there, the pattern slowly emerging. Suddenly, there was a small commotion near the tea-table. A cry of distress, sharp and unmistakable. Heads turned. Clara Hewitt, her face drained of colour, was supporting her mother, who seemed to stagger and clutch at her chest. The guests surged forward, but were held back by the brisk authority of Dr. Fallow. "Give her air, please," the doctor barked, pushing through the crowd. Miss Marple rose carefully from her chair, tucking her knitting into her handbag. She moved closer, unhurried yet alert. Lavinia Hewitt was seated now, a strained smile fixed on her lips. "It's nothing," Lavinia croaked. "Just the heat." Dr. Fallow fussed over her, checking her pulse, murmuring instructions about shade, cool compresses, rest. The birthday cake, with its 3 tiers and lavish sugar roses, stood abandoned, untouched. The party stumbled on awkwardly, guests speaking in strained voices, casting worried glances toward Lavinia. Yet, under their concern, Miss Marple detected something sharper, anticipation, relief. By evening, as the last of the villagers departed and the marquee flapped in the evening breeze, Lavinia had been carried upstairs to bed. Clara assured the remaining guests that the doctor was confident it was a mere fainting spell, nothing serious. But as Miss Marple made her way back to her neat little cottage by the churchyard, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted at Heatherfield Hall that afternoon. Not simply a fainting spell, not simply old age. Something had begun, and Miss Marple, though she had no evidence to offer, sensed that before it ended, darker things would come to light. Chapter 2. Morning came soft and misty over Little Belton, but the village was already alive with whispers. At the Greystone tea-rooms, the usual clink of cups and scrape of chairs was accompanied by lowered voices and furtive glances. Mrs. Pennington, her fox-fur stole wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders, leaned conspiratorially across the table toward Mrs. Templeton. "I told you, didn't I?" she said, voice quivering with the delicious thrill of scandal. All that energy at her age. It wasn't natural. Something bound to give, and now look! Mrs. Templeton stirred her tea without drinking it. Dr. Fallow said it was a faint, nothing more. Doctors! Mrs. Pennington sniffed. Half the time they say what people pay them to say. Miss Marple, seated alone at a small table by the window, appeared to be absorbed in the embroidery she had brought with her. A delicate pattern of violets bloomed steadily beneath her needle, but her ears remained keenly attuned to the ebb and flow of conversation around her. From another corner, Mr. Arkwright, the postmaster, was holding forth to a clutch of men over their bacon and eggs. "She's had her fingers in every pie for years, that one," he said, tapping the table emphatically. "Land deals, village council, charity funds, you name it. It's a wonder more haven't dropped from the strain." Across the room, young Emily Trent whispered urgently to her friend Alice Meadows. "It's horrible, isn't it?" she said. "Poor Mrs. Hewitt. Though—" she hesitated, eyes darting toward Miss Marple's table, then lowered her voice further. "Some say she had a way of holding things over people." Alice blinked. "Blackmail?" Emily flushed. "Not exactly, but secrets. She always knew just the wrong thing about you." Miss Marple pricked her finger lightly, unnoticed, and dabbed it with a corner of her handkerchief. A slip of the needle could happen to anyone. But she found it curious how, even now, few spoke of Lavinia Hewitt with unguarded warmth. Respect, yes. Fear, perhaps. But affection, that was thin on the ground. Later that afternoon, the village, square filled with a quiet hum of activity, as Clara Hewitt emerged from the post office, her arms full of parcels. She wore a stiff, determined look, as if daring the villagers to approach her. None did. At the same moment, Millicent Hewitt was seen hurrying along the high street, her hat askew, clutching a battered satchel against her side. She paused briefly before the church, then darted inside, unnoticed by most, except by Miss Marple, who happened to be passing at that very moment on her way to the grocer's. Miss Marple didn't stop. She didn't need to. Years of village life had taught her that appearances spoke volumes. Millicent's pale face, her shaking hands, the way she glanced nervously over her shoulder before slipping through the heavy oak doors. These things were eloquent in their own way. That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her embroidery and contemplated the day's small collection of observations. No evidence, of course, only patterns, familiar ones. There had been fear in the village today, but not only for Lavinia Hewitt's health. Fear for themselves, fear of what might come to light if certain stones were overturned. As Miss Marple sipped her evening tea, a knock sounded at her door. She rose and opened it to find Clara Hewitt standing stiffly on the step, hat in hand, eyes ringed with fatigue. "Miss Marple," she said without preamble, "may I come in?" Miss Marple smiled gently and stepped aside. "Of course, my dear. Do sit down." Clara hesitated on the threshold, then entered, seating herself rigidly in the parlour. She did not touch the tea Miss Marple offered, nor the slice of seed cake placed politely before her. "I thought you should know," Clara said after a pause, voice tight. "Mother is worse this evening. Dr. Fallow says he is concerned." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I am sorry to hear it." Clara licked her lips. "He suggests it might be wise to consider certain arrangements, in case—" She faltered. "In case she doesn't recover." Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically, but said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. Finally, Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not only that, you see. Things have been disappearing." "Disappearing?" Clara nodded sharply. "Small things. Personal things, jewellery, letters. I thought perhaps Mother had misplaced them. But now—" She broke off, biting her lip. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but non-committal. "Have you informed the police?" "No." Clara's reaction was swift, almost panicked. "We don't want to cause a scandal, not while Mother's still fighting." Miss Marple nodded again, filing away every word, every hesitation. "Sometimes," she said gently, "secrets have a way of slipping out, however carefully one guards them." Clara paled visibly. When she finally departed, leaving the little cottage silent once more, Miss Marple returned to her embroidery. Her needle moved steadily, the pattern growing ever more intricate. Somewhere, she was certain, someone else's pattern was unravelling just as steadily, and soon the dropped stitch would show. Chapter 3. Morning mist clung to the hedgerows as Miss Marple made her way to Heatherfield Hall, summoned by an unexpected note from Clara Hewitt. The path wound through dew-laden fields, where cows stared placidly and crows picked along the furrows. The ordinary beauty of Little Belton seemed almost too serene, as if deliberately disguising the undercurrents roiling just beneath. Clara greeted her at the door, looking harried but determined. The faint scent of lavender polish hung in the air, attempting, without much success, to mask a sharper, acrid note that Miss Marple could not immediately place. "She's sleeping now," Clara said in a low voice, leading Miss Marple through the wide, dim corridors toward the morning room. "But Dr. Fallow, he's not hopeful." The morning room was a bright, airy place with windows overlooking the side gardens. Tea had been laid out, untouched. Millicent sat perched stiffly on the window seat, her gaze fixed on the lawns outside. At the sight of Miss Marple, she sprang up. "Oh, thank goodness you're here!" Millicent burst out. Clara said you might understand." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Perhaps, dear, perhaps. Tell me what troubles you." Millicent twisted her fingers together, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mother's jewellery box, it's missing." Clara spoke quickly. "Not the whole box, just certain pieces. A brooch, a signet ring, some letters too, and something else." She hesitated, exchanging a glance with her sister. "A sewing kit," Millicent finished awkwardly. "An old one, nothing valuable." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. A sewing kit? Clara shrugged. A small thing. Mother kept it on her nightstand. Sentimental, I suppose. An old velvet case with her initials stitched on the cover. Miss Marple filed the detail away with quiet precision. And when was it noticed missing? Yesterday evening, said Clara. After the party, when we got her upstairs. Millicent went to fetch her a fresh handkerchief, and it was gone. At first we thought she'd misplaced it, but with the other things missing too, she broke off, biting her lip. Millicent added hastily, "We didn't want to raise an alarm. Mother hates fuss." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the sideboard, where a small vase of fading lilacs drooped sadly. Her sharp mind pieced the facts together carefully. Stolen jewellery, vanishing letters, a missing sewing kit, all personal items, all easily hidden. Nothing so far that spoke openly of violence. Yet there was an air of urgency about the thefts, as if someone feared what those objects might reveal. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the window. From here she could see the servants moving about the garden. John the gardener clipping the rose bushes, Martha the housemaid shaking out a rug. Their faces betrayed nothing. Who had access to the house during the party? She asked casually. Everyone, Clara admitted grimly. The doors were open all afternoon. Guests wandered in and out, fetching things, using the lavatory. We couldn't police everyone. And the servants? Clara stiffened. Martha has been with us for years. John, nearly as long. No reason to suspect either of them. Miss Marple made no comment. Long acquaintance, she knew, was no proof against temptation. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Fallow entered without waiting for a reply, his hat still in his hand. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, sounding faintly disapproving, as if he had stumbled into a consultation he had not sanctioned. "I hadn't realized you were involved." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, merely a friendly visit." He grunted and turned to Clara. "I've written to a specialist in Market Chisbury. If she's strong enough to travel, I recommend transferring her for observation." Clara nodded wearily. "Thank you, Doctor." Miss Marple, watching closely, caught the brief flicker of hesitation that crossed Millicent's face at the word observation, as if some private calculation had been disturbed. She filed that reaction away, too. By the time Miss Marple left Heatherfield Hall, the morning mist had lifted, revealing the rolling green hills of Little Belton sparkling under a weak sun. At the gate she paused, glancing back at the grand house, crouching behind its manicured hedges. Something was terribly wrong at Heatherfield. Not simply illness, not simply petty theft. The pattern, faint but undeniable, was beginning to show itself, and Miss Marple, careful as ever, intended to follow every stitch until the full design revealed itself. Chapter 4. By midday, the village of Little Belton had settled into its usual routine, but underneath the surface the whispers had sharpened into pointed fingers. At the Greystone tea-rooms, Mrs. Pennington wasted no time in shaping the village's opinion. "Mark my words," she said over her scone. "It's that girl Martha, always flitting about with her eyes down. Servants notice things they shouldn't, you know." Across the table, Mr. Arkwright grunted in agreement. If valuables have gone missing, well, it wouldn't be the first time a maid's sticky fingers got the better of her. Miss Marple, seated discreetly at a nearby table with her knitting once again in hand, listened without interruption. She noted the eagerness with which suspicion latched onto the easy target, the working-class girl, modest, invisible, and most importantly, convenient. Convenient, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely the same as correct. Outside, near the village green, Constable Davis questioned John the gardener beneath the swaying branches of the great chestnut tree. "You were seen near the side doors during the party," Davis said, not unkindly. "Anything to tell us, John?" The gardener wiped his hands on his trousers and shook his head. "Just fetching some pots, sir. Mrs. Hewitt asked me to bring in the fuchsias before the rain." Davis scribbled something in his notebook, but didn't press further. After all, John had a solid reputation, steady work, no debts, no known grudges. Inside Heatherfield Hall, the atmosphere had shifted uneasily. Clara moved through the house with military briskness, speaking in clipped sentences. Millicent hovered nervously in the background, her face paler than usual, her words hesitant. "Perhaps," Clara said to Dr. Fallow that afternoon, "we should call in the police formally." Dr. Fallow shook his head. Without clear evidence of theft or foul play, it would only bring scandal, and for what? Misplaced trinkets? Clara said nothing, but her mouth tightened. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet visit to the kitchen, where Martha scrubbed dishes furiously, her sleeves rolled high. "A terrible business," Miss Marple said softly, settling herself on a stool by the door. Martha jumped, sloshing water over the counter. Oh, yes, ma'am. Terrible." Miss Marple watched her closely. Martha's hands trembled, but whether from fear, anger, or exhaustion was harder to say. Such pretty things Mrs. Hewitt had, Miss Marple mused. Easy for small things to go missing, don't you think, when so many come and go? Martha pressed her lips together, shoulders stiff. "I'd never touch a thing, ma'am. Not me." "No, of course not," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "But others, perhaps? Guests wandering about? Or even family members in distress?" Martha hesitated. "It's not my place to say," she muttered. Miss Marple smiled gently, reaching for her shawl. "Sometimes, my dear, silence says quite a lot." As she made her way back to the village, Miss Marple turned over the events in her mind. Martha, the convenient suspect, protested too simply, too directly. Clara, controlling, anxious, seemed almost desperate to keep things quiet. Millicent, nervous, secretive, was hiding something, though what it was remained murky. And then there was the missing sewing kit. Miss Marple frowned slightly. In her long experience, thieves of valuable objects rarely bothered with sentimental items of no obvious worth, unless, of course, those sentimental items hid something more dangerous. That evening, the village held an informal gathering at the vicarage, a kind of strained attempt at normalcy. Mrs. Templeton handed around lukewarm punch, while conversations drifted, aimless and brittle. Miss Marple, perched on a modest wooden chair near the fireplace, listened keenly. "Such a shame, such a shame," Mrs. Pennington said for the third time, dabbing theatrically at her eyes. "Poor dear Lavinia, to fall ill so suddenly." "Not so sudden," remarked Mr. Arkwright with a sniff. "She had enemies. A woman like that. Well, she collected grievances like a child collects marbles." A hush fell at his words. People glanced at one another uneasily. Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. Enemies, yes. Not simply Martha. Perhaps not even John the gardener, despite the suspicious timing. Lavinia Hewitt had ruled over Little Belton for years with iron, politeness, keeping many secrets in her pocket, and secrets, Miss Marple knew, had sharp edges. As the evening wore on, the vicar rose to read a brief prayer for Mrs. Hewitt's recovery, heads bowed dutifully, but the atmosphere was stiff, the amens hollow. Miss Marple left early, stepping out into the cool night. The stars shimmered faintly overhead, and a faint breeze stirred the leaves. At her gate she paused. There, resting on her doormat, was a single white envelope, unaddressed, sealed in old-fashioned red wax. She picked it up carefully, heart beating a little faster. Inside was a single piece of paper, a scrap torn from a larger sheet. On it, scrawled in hurried, slanted writing, were just 3 words. Look beneath needle. Chapter 5. Miss Marple stood a moment longer on her doorstep, the mysterious message pinched lightly between her fingers. The ink had blurred slightly, as if the writer's hand had been shaking, or the note had been written in haste. Look beneath needle. She turned the envelope over once more. No signature. No seal but the simple, almost archaic blob of red wax. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple lit the lamp and laid the note flat on the small writing desk by the window. Her mind moved carefully, not leaping ahead, but following the quiet, logical pathways that years of observation had worn into her habits. The missing sewing kit. Lavinia Hewitt's old velvet sewing case, stitched with her initials, look beneath, needle. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was almost charmingly literal. Almost. But where was the kit now? She rose and fetched her knitting basket from the corner, fingertips grazing the familiar tools inside. Steel needles, fine cotton, small scissors. Objects that were both innocent and, in the right hands, potentially deadly. In villages like Little Belton, murder, when it happened, was never crude. It was tidy, almost domestic, and like a dropped stitch, it often went unnoticed until the entire pattern unravelled. Early the next morning, Miss Marple made her way back to Heatherfield Hall under the pretext of delivering a jar of her special, blackcurrant jam for the convalescent. Clara met her at the door, dark circles smudging the skin beneath her eyes. "She's weaker today," Clara said without being asked. "Dr. Fallow is coming again this afternoon." Miss Marple offered sympathetic noises, but kept her gaze steady. "Would it trouble you terribly if I sat with her a while? I find a quiet presence can sometimes be soothing." Clara hesitated, her hands twisting together. Then at last she nodded. "If you think it would help." Miss Marple was shown to Lavinia Hewitt's bedroom, a grand but austere space lined with heavy oak furniture and faded floral curtains. The elder Mrs. Hewitt lay in a high bed, her skin as pale as the linen tucked around her. Her breath came shallow and quick, but her eyes, her sharp blue eyes, fluttered open briefly at Miss Marple's approach. Miss Marple settled into a chair, near the window, knitting idly, her presence unobtrusive. It was then, with the room quiet, save for the ticking of the small carriage clock on the mantel, that she let her gaze drift. The nightstand was neatly arranged. A glass of water, a small porcelain dish of pills, a handkerchief folded with military precision, but no velvet sewing kit. She let an hour pass, working steadily on her embroidery, before finally rising to stretch her legs. Near the wardrobe stood a narrow chest of drawers, its top drawer slightly ajar. Almost absently, Miss Marple drifted closer, adjusting her shawl, one hand resting lightly on the drawer's edge. Inside were odds and ends, old letters tied with faded ribbon, a silver-backed hairbrush, a scattering of embroidery silks. And there, pushed to the back, nearly invisible against the dark wood lining, was a crumpled scrap of velvet. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. The case was smaller than she'd expected, no larger than a folded handkerchief, and worn thin at the edges. The initials LH were stitched faintly in white thread on the corner. It opened stiffly under her fingers, the inside lined with tiny slots for needles and thread. Miss Marple's keen eyes noticed it at once, a slight bulge in the stitched lining just behind the row of needles. Look beneath needle. Her fingertips worked gently along the seam until she found a tiny gap, clumsily restitched with mismatched thread. With quiet precision, she eased the lining apart. Inside was a thin sliver of paper, no bigger than a visiting card, folded twice. She unfolded it carefully. It was a note written in Lavinia Hewitt's unmistakable hand, sharp, angular, impatient. To be opened only if harm befalls me. Trust no one, not even family. The truth lies with the debts unpaid. Miss Marple's mouth tightened slightly. She tucked the paper back into the velvet case, closed the drawer neatly, and resumed her seat by the window. Outside, the sound of Clara's voice drifted faintly up from the gardens, brisk and commanding. Family. Trust no one. Miss Marple sat silently, her knitting needles clicking softly once more, her mind busy with connections. Debts unpaid, not financial, perhaps, but emotional debts, unpaid grievances, festering resentments. She knew better than to move too quickly. In Little Belton, secrets ripened in silence before falling heavily into the light. And someone, she was quite certain, was watching even now, waiting to see who would discover the hidden truth first. The trap was already baited. It only remained to see who would spring it. Chapter 6. The days that followed Miss Marple's discovery passed with a brittle kind of quiet. Heatherfield Hall stood shrouded in a hush that seemed deeper than mere illness. Guests no longer called. The curtains remained half-drawn. Even the servants moved with exaggerated care, as if too much noise might hasten some inevitable collapse. Miss Marple did not rush. She knew better than to disturb a web before its strands were fully spun. Instead, she made polite visits to the vicarage, to the tea-rooms, to the post office, each one offering fragments of conversation, loose threads of unease that she collected like a patient weaver. It was during one such visit, over a pot of bitter tea at the Greystone tea-rooms, that she encountered Emily Trent again. The girl sat alone, stirring her tea absently, her face pinched with tension. When Miss Marple approached, Emily startled visibly, then offered a wan smile. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple said, settling opposite her without waiting for invitation. "A trying time for the village, isn't it?" Emily nodded, fingers tightening around her cup. "I imagine you knew Mrs. Hewitt well." Emily hesitated. Everyone knew her. Miss Marple smiled gently. Knowing and liking are often very different things. A flush rose in Emily's cheeks. She had ways, Emily said haltingly, of making one feel small, helpless, especially if you disappointed her. Or owed her something, Miss Marple suggested mildly. Emily's eyes darted away. She shook her head, but her mouth trembled slightly. Miss Marple didn't press. She merely sat, sipping her tea, allowing the silence to stretch thin and taut between them. At last, Emily leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Wasn't just me. Lots of people she helped, but she always expected repayment, one way or another. Miss Marple nodded, as if this were merely the most natural thing in the world. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, where she found John the gardener trimming the yew hedges. He straightened at her approach, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Good afternoon, John," she said pleasantly. "A warm day for it." He grunted a non-committal reply. Miss Marple, undeterred, admired the neatness of his clipping. "A careful hand," she said. "One must be precise with these old hedges. One wrong snip and the whole shape suffers." John glanced at her warily. "Takes patience, that's all." Yes, much like living in a village. Everyone watching, everyone remembering. He said nothing. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift over the grave markers, the stones leaning toward one another like silent conspirators. "I wonder," she said softly, almost to herself, "how many promises lie buried here? Promises broken, debts unpaid." John's hand tightened on the shears. A muscle flickered in his jaw. Miss Marple smiled, a small, contented smile, and left him to his work. By evening, word reached the village that another incident had occurred at Heatherfield Hall. This time, it was not Lavinia Hewitt's frail health that caused the stir, but the discovery of a hidden drawer, one tucked away in the old escritoire in her private sitting room. It was Martha, the housemaid, who found it. "I swear, ma'am, I weren't snooping," she babbled to Clara and Millicent in the main hall. "Just dusting, like always, only I knocked the corner and out it popped." Inside the hidden drawer was a faded notebook, its cover cracked and brittle with age. Its contents, however, were anything but benign. Names, dates, amounts, a ledger of sorts, one listing various villagers alongside sums of money, favours performed, debts acknowledged, and next to some names, small symbols in Lavinia Hewitt's sharp hand, a star, a dagger, a question mark. Clara seized the book at once, her face draining of colour. "No need for this to leave the family," she said tightly, but it was too late. Gossip travelled faster than footsteps in Little Belton. By nightfall, half the village buzzed with theories. "She owned half of us," Mr. Arkwright exclaimed in the tea-room, slamming his hand against the table. "Loans, threats, promises, all twisted round her little finger," Mrs. Pennington sniffed. "And now someone's trying to cover it up. That ledger, it's a death sentence if it gets out." Miss Marple listened carefully, but said little. She had expected as much. The debts Lavinia spoke of in her secret note were not financial alone. They were debts of loyalty, of silence, of fear. And someone perhaps many someones, had everything to lose if the full truth emerged. But one thread still tugged at her mind. The missing jewellery, the stolen letters, the note to look beneath needle. It wasn't random. Someone had been desperate to find that sewing kit and what it contained before it could be uncovered by others. Someone who knew exactly what secrets Lavinia Hewitt had hidden among the ordinary trappings of village life, and now that secrets were stirring in the open, Miss Marple knew the web would tighten, and more dangerous moves would soon follow. Chapter 7. 2 days after the ledger's discovery, little Belton awoke to a fresh scandal. Martha, the housemaid, had vanished. It was Mrs. Pennington who spread the news first, appearing breathless at the vicarage steps where Miss Marple happened to be admiring a patch of late roses. "Gone," Mrs. Pennington gasped. "Run off in the night, without so much as a by your leave. Clara Hewitt found her bed empty this morning. Clothes gone, trunk missing." Miss Marple, bending to deadhead a rose, made no exclamation. She merely plucked the faded bloom free and let it fall to the ground. By noon, the village was buzzing. At Greystone tea rooms, theories bloomed faster than daisies. "She must have stolen something. Knew she'd be caught," said Mr. Arkwright. "No, no," Mrs. Templeton countered, voice quivering with excitement. "Poor girl must have been terrified. After that ledger came to light, perhaps she knew too much." Miss Marple listened carefully from her usual corner. She found it interesting that no one considered a third possibility, that Martha, frightened or not, might not have left of her own free will. Later that afternoon, Constable Davis trudged up the lane to Heatherfield Hall. Clara greeted him stiffly at the door, Millicent hovering like a nervous shadow behind her. "Did she say anything?" Davis asked. "Leave a note?" "Nothing," Clara said curtly. "She simply disappeared." Millicent, fiddling with the hem of her cardigan, murmured, "She seemed frightened yesterday." "Of whom?" Davis asked sharply. Millicent swallowed. I don't know." Miss Marple, lingering unobtrusively nearby, caught the hesitation. She tucked it away in her mind, adding it to the growing tapestry of half-spoken truths. Later still, as dusk crept across the village, Miss Marple paid a call to Dr. Fallow. The doctor, brusque as ever, seemed ill at ease. "She wasn't well, you know," he said, tapping ash from his pipe. "Martha, I mean, nervous sort. Imaginings, perhaps. No stamina." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Mrs. Hewitt?" Dr. Fallow's expression darkened. "Failing. She's strong, but even strength has its limits." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the missing items?" Hesitated. "Nothing decisive. Personal things mostly. Jewellery, yes. But no sign of forced entry. No evidence against anyone." His mouth twisted. "Only gossip." "Gossip," Miss Marple said gently, "is often a warning cry before the storm." The doctor frowned, but she did not explain. That evening, sitting in her neat parlour, Miss Marple laid out the facts once again. First, the thefts, targeted, precise, not random. Second, the ledger, discovered by chance, but revealing debts and grudges festering quietly for years. Third, the sewing kit, hidden carefully, containing a warning Lavinia Hewitt had not dared entrust openly to anyone. And now, a disappearance. A pattern was emerging, one of growing desperation. Someone had tried to recover Lavinia's secrets before they could come to light. Someone had failed. And now they were tightening their grip. Outside, the village settled into uneasy darkness. Inside, Miss Marple selected a fresh sheet of notepaper and wrote 2 brief notes, one to Constable Davis, requesting a discreet word, the other a short invitation. To Clara Hewitt, she chose her words carefully. No accusations, no suspicions, merely a suggestion that Clara might wish to call for tea the following afternoon. Because Miss Marple knew it was time to begin testing the strands of the web. Gently, delicately, but firmly enough to see who trembled. Before she set her pen down, a quiet knock sounded at the door. She rose and opened it. Millicent stood there, white-faced and trembling. "Please," the girl whispered, eyes wide with some terrible inner fear. "Miss Marple, I need to tell you something." Miss Marple stepped aside without a word, ushering the girl into the warm, lamplit room. Outside, the first rain in days began to fall, pattering against the windows like faint, frantic fingers. The storm, Miss Marple thought, had truly begun. Chapter 8. Millicent sat hunched on the edge of Miss Marple's chair, twisting a damp handkerchief in her fingers. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered, voice hoarse with emotion. "Clara would be furious if she knew." Miss Marple, calm and composed, poured a small cup of tea and placed it gently before her. "Sometimes, dear," she said softly, "the burden of silence is heavier than the burden of truth." Millicent stared into the cup as if it might somehow provide answers. "I found something," she said after a long pause. "The night after the party. I didn't know what it meant." "What did you find, child?" Miss Marple asked gently. Millicent's hands trembled. It was a brooch, Mother's gold locket. It had been missing for months, but I found it in Martha's room. Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence speak for her. Millicent rushed on, desperate now. "I confronted her. Martha, mean. She cried, said she'd never stolen it, that someone had planted it. But I didn't believe her. I was so sure." She bit her lip hard, eyes bright with tears. "And now she's gone." Miss Marple reached out and patted Millicent's hand. "Sometimes, dear, guilt lies not in the theft, but in the knowing and doing nothing." Millicent shook her head fiercely. "I didn't tell anyone. I was too afraid. Mother would have made it a scandal." Miss Marple's voice remained kind. It is not too late to put things right. When Millicent had gone, after much reassurance and one more cup of tea, Miss Marple sat very still in the quiet room. Pieces were shifting at last. The planted locket suggested more than petty theft. It suggested deliberate framing. Someone had needed Martha discredited. Someone who understood that in a village like Little Belton, a servant's reputation could be easily and thoroughly destroyed. Miss Marple smiled slightly. It was time to tug the thread harder. The next morning, she paid a call to Heatherfield, all under the pretence of delivering a new batch of preserves. Clara, drawn and stiff, received her in the morning room. "I suppose you've heard about Martha," Clara said with a tight smile. Miss Marple inclined her head. "The village speaks quickly. She stole from us," Clara said briskly. "There's no doubt." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. She set the jar of preserves down carefully. "I wonder, though, has anyone searched the attic?" Clara blinked. The attic! Why on earth would we? Miss Marple's smile was innocent. Sometimes those fleeing in haste leave things behind, or sometimes they hide things, hoping to return later. Clara hesitated. Then, with visible reluctance, she summoned John the gardener to fetch the attic keys. The search, conducted under Clara's impatient supervision, yielded little at first. Dusty trunks, old furniture, the faint scent of mothballs and age. But in the far corner, behind a battered chest of drawers, Miss Marple spotted something. A small parcel, wrapped hastily in brown paper, tucked beneath a broken chair leg. Constable Davis, summoned at Miss Marple's polite suggestion, unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay several of Lavinia Hewitt's missing items, the signet ring, the brooch, a pearl earring, and tucked neatly, beside them, a folded piece of paper bearing Martha's name in blocky handwriting. It was too perfect, too convenient. Davis frowned, but Clara seized on it eagerly. There! Proof, if ever there was! Miss Marple said nothing, though her mind was whirring. No thief, truly intending escape, would have hidden their spoils in the very house they were fleeing. Nor would they have labelled the evidence so obligingly. It was a plant, a poor one, hurried and clumsy, and it told her something crucial. The real culprit was growing desperate. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple orchestrated a small gathering at her cottage. Clara, Millicent, Dr. Fallow, and Mr. Arkwright, the most vocal in their condemnation of Martha. Tea was served, light conversation encouraged, only when cups were half empty, and tempers relaxed by the warmth and familiarity of the setting, did Miss Marple lay her trap. "So curious," she said idly, threading her knitting needle through a row of stitches. "How very neat that bundle was." The room stirred faintly. "I mean," she continued, smiling gently, "who would think to wrap stolen items so carefully, label them, and hide them here, when escape was already at hand?" Silence stretched thin across the room. Then Clara laughed, a brittle, too loud sound. Well, criminals aren't known for their intelligence. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. No, perhaps not. But planners, those who seek to blame others, are often quite intelligent. Intelligent enough, for instance, to anticipate suspicion, but not quite intelligent enough to imagine how obvious their precautions might seem to an impartial observer. Dr. Fallow shifted in his chair. Millicent stared at the floor. Mr. Arkwright coughed into his handkerchief. Miss Marple sipped her tea, then added lightly, "And then there's the matter of the debts, the ledger. Some had much to lose if old secrets came to light." She let her words hang in the air, feigning a glance out the window, as if distracted by the gathering clouds. And it was then, just then, that Clara's hand, resting on the arm of her chair, tightened into a white-knuckled fist, a small thing, a telling thing. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her trap sprung not by accusations, but by the smallest, most human betrayals. Chapter 9. The tea had long gone cold by the time Clara Hewitt set down her cup with a clink louder than necessary. The room sat thick with unspoken things, the soft ticking of the mantel clock marking each strained second. Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair, her knitting abandoned in her lap. She regarded Clara, not unkindly, but with the precise, steady gaze of someone who had seen all too many tangled souls in her time. "Clara, dear," she said quietly, "it's a very dangerous thing, underestimating the cleverness of others." Clara's face froze, then twisted in a smile too sharp to be real. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Miss Marple continued, her voice as gentle as ever. "The ledger made you vulnerable, didn't it? Your name featured there, I think, several times." Mr. Arkwright shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Fallow averted his eyes. Clara's hands curled tightly into fists on her lap. "It's ridiculous. Mother lent money to half the village. It doesn't mean anything." "Perhaps," Miss Marple allowed, "but it was not the money, was it? It was the promises, the favours owed, the leverage." She turned to the others. "You see, Mrs. Hewitt's power was not in her wealth. It was in what she knew, what she kept hidden, what she could call upon when she wished." Silence. "Clara knew," Miss Marple said softly, "that once her mother was gone, many debts would be forgiven, forgotten. She would lose her influence, her standing." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Miss Marple held up a hand so gently it could hardly be called a rebuke. But it was not only that, was it? There was something more personal, something tied to the missing items, the jewellery, the letters, the sewing kit. A slight tremor passed over Clara's face. Miss Marple's voice dropped, threading its way through the heavy air. The sewing kit hid a message, a warning, a testament of sorts. Lavinia Hewitt feared what might happen if she died unexpectedly. She suspected foul play might not be beyond her own blood. Clara shot to her feet. "Lies!" she snapped, her voice brittle with panic. "Mother was old, sick. She brought this on herself." No one answered. Even Millicent shrank back, her face pale and stricken. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "You tampered with her medicine. You added a small, steady dose of something undetectable. A cardiac depressant, perhaps? Enough to weaken, but not to kill swiftly. Enough to make her vulnerable. Enough to hasten what might have come in time anyway." Clara's breathing grew, ragged. "You planted the stolen items," Miss Marple continued gently. "First in Martha's room, so that if suspicions arose, the obvious scapegoat was ready. Then, when Martha fled, or was made to flee, you planted a second bundle in the attic to reinforce the lie." Constable Davis, standing by the doorway, took a slow step forward, his hand brushing the notebook at his hip. "You were clever, Clara, but you forgot the most important thing of all." Clara stared at her, defiant and trembling. Miss Marple's blue eyes softened. "You forgot that human nature is not so easily controlled. Guilt leaks out, in a look, a gesture, a careless word." Clara's mouth moved soundlessly, as if grasping for a defence that would not come. And then, as if the fight had simply drained from her, she sank back into her chair, the starch gone from her spine. "I had no choice," she said dully. "She would have destroyed me. She already had." Miss Marple regarded her with a deep, quiet sadness. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but two wrongs rarely make a right, dear." Constable Davis cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll need to take you into town, Mrs. Hewitt." Clara said nothing. She simply rose and allowed herself to be led away. her steps slow and hollow. When they were gone, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then Dr. Fallows stirred uncomfortably. "What will become of Heatherfield Hall, I wonder?" Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. "Someone will inherit, I expect. Millicent, perhaps." Millicent gave a small, startled gasp. Miss Marple smiled at her kindly. "Your mother, for all her flaws, meant to protect you in the end, I think. The debts she recorded were her shield, for you as much as for herself." Millicent's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Miss Marple rose, gathering her things. Outside, the village continued as if nothing had changed. The postman, whistling down the lane, a dog barking distantly near the green. But Miss Marple knew differently. A web had been torn. Secrets had been dragged into the light. Justice, in its quiet, inexorable way, had been served, but not without cost, never without cost. Chapter 10. The air around Little Belton had settled into an unhurried calm, though it was a calm that held a certain weight, one that would linger long after the final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. Miss Marple sat in her small parlour, her knitting forgotten beside her, the last few moments of the mystery playing themselves over and over. In her mind, she had seen many cases unfold in her time, but this one, this tale of power, betrayal, and hidden debts, had been a particularly intricate weave. Outside, the sun slipped behind the clouds, casting a soft, melancholy light over the quiet streets. Life would move on for Little Belton, of course. It always did. But there was something different now. The shadows of secrets no longer lingered in the corners. In the aftermath of Clara's confession and arrest, the villagers returned to their lives, though with more subdued expressions, their conversations quieter, as though the very act of discussing the events too openly might somehow break the fragile calm. Miss Marple had been right all along. Clara's desperate actions had stemmed not just from the fear of losing power, but from the terror of being exposed. The hidden ledger, the stolen items, the calculated framing of Martha, all had been part of a larger plan to control what would come after Lavinia's death. In the stillness of her parlour, Miss Marple turned her thoughts back to the note that had begun everything. Look beneath needle. It had been the simplest of clues, the smallest of gestures, yet it had unlocked the entire chain of events. She allowed herself a brief smile. For all her humble appearance, Miss Marple knew the human heart and the human tendency to slip up when weighed down by guilt. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple rose slowly, smoothing her dress as she opened it. Millicent stood on the threshold, her eyes red from crying, but there was a softness to her posture now, a quiet acceptance. No longer the nervous girl who had walked into Miss Marple's cottage weeks ago, but someone who had begun to make sense of the weight she had carried for so long. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" Millicent asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course, my dear. Come right in." Millicent stepped inside, her fingers still clutching the handkerchief she had wrung to bits in her hands. "Is it true?" she asked after a moment, as they settled at the table with tea, "that everything was planned? That my mother knew it was all going to happen?" Miss Marple nodded gently, sipping her tea. "Yes, I believe she did, though she did not have all the pieces in place herself. She was a careful woman, Millicent, but she was also a mother, and that comes with a particular kind of insight. "She was afraid, wasn't she?" Millicent asked, staring into her cup. "Afraid of what would happen if she left too much power to Clara?" Miss Marple sighed softly. "I think she was afraid of what anyone would do, given such power. Her control, though subtle, was all that stood between Clara and a very different future. And she knew Clara's ambition." Millicent blinked hard, as if fighting back tears. I didn't know what was happening. It all seemed so normal. Until it wasn't." Miss Marple set her cup down, her voice soft but firm. "There are many kinds of burdens in life, Millicent. Some are imposed upon us, others we choose ourselves. Your mother made many choices for you, and for herself, but she made them in the hope of sparing you from the same dark paths she had walked." Millicent nodded slowly, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling over her. After a long pause, Millicent looked up. "What happens now, Miss Marple?" "Now," Miss Marple said, "you have the chance to decide what your own life will be. You are no longer bound by your mother's choices. You can step away from all the secrets and lies." Millicent sat in silence, absorbing the enormity of the words. For the first time in a long while, she seemed to breathe a little easier, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. "Well then," Millicent said, her voice trembling with a newfound resolve, "I suppose it's time for me to take responsibility for my own life." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "I believe that's the first step toward freedom, dear." As Millicent left the cottage, a new lightness in her step, Miss Marple turned her thoughts once again to the events that had unfolded. The pieces of the mystery were now clear, each one fitting together perfectly, and though justice had been served, the quiet aftermath of it all was both bittersweet and inevitable. The villagers would carry on. The truth, now out in the open, would remain in the past. But some truths, Miss Marple knew, were never truly buried. They simply became part of the air one breathed, woven into the fabric of life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple looked out the window, her heart heavy yet content. The mysteries had been solved, but the web of human nature, tangled as it was, would always need careful unravelling, and she, Miss Marple, would always be there to do it, one small stitch at a time.